Thank you very much, Peter. I'm honored to be hosting this conversation between two university presidents who've been my mentors over the past several years and who entrusted me with the fascinating challenge of serving as the first president of Yale-NUS College. So I recall quite vividly my early conversations with Rick about Yale-NUS when I was talking about if I could help out in some way with the development of the humanities curriculum. I didn't anticipate what was in for me. And then later my conversations with Chuan as we got to know each other over the course of developing the college, and in the spring of 2012 when the college was looking for a president and we were getting to know each other a little bit better. Let me just say how delighted I am to have had this opportunity to found a new college. I mean, it doesn't come along all that often. And to do so in the company of, and to put into practice the vision of two such remarkable leaders. In the past 7 years, Chuan has had a transformative impact on the National University of Singapore, which is now widely recognized as one of the foremost universities in Asia and indeed in the world. He'll be formally introduced later today by my colleague Charles Balin, so let me just mention a couple of his signature initiatives at the moment. He's been a leader of Singapore's Biomedical Sciences Initiative. He's chaired the International Alliance of Research Universities, of which both Yale and NUS are members, and he currently chairs the World Economic Forum's Global University Leaders Forum. He's built a tremendous amount of, a number of wonderful buildings on the NUS campus as well, and he's overseen impressive projects including the University Town campus, which is home to Yale-NUS College. Rick Levin served for 20 years as president of Yale University and is now chief executive officer of Coursera, an innovative provider of online education. During his time at Yale, Rick transformed the physical infrastructure of Yale, notably by renovating all of its 12 residential colleges and developing plans for 2 new colleges. He greatly enhanced the university's relations with the city of New Haven. He led the internationalization of the university with the goal of making Yale a global university of consequence. He strengthened the sciences and maintained the traditional strength of Yale in the humanities, social sciences, the professions, and the arts. And of course, he worked with Chuan to found Yale-NUS College. So I'm going to just ask the two presidents some questions and get a conversation started, but in a few minutes I'll ask for questions from the floor. We have mics at stand, so please feel free to line up. I'll give you the signal when I'm about to open it up a little more broadly. Chuan, I thought I'd just start by asking you, what caused Singapore and NUS to be interested in introducing this notion of liberal arts education here in Singapore?
Oh, thanks, Pericles, and I want to start first by thanking Rick, Peter, Salave, and colleagues from Yale and Yale-NUS, and all of you really for your support and your presence. If you look at modern Singapore today, it'll be hard for you to think that the motivating force behind a lot of what we do is constructive paranoia. And the reason is because we are a small little island without any resources, now with only 40,000 births every year and declining. And what it means is that we have to constantly think about how we keep the human capital edge in order to stay relevant and to be able to continue to be successful. From the university's point of view, clearly, like Singapore, we have to continue to reinvent ourselves. And indeed, as the nature of the Singapore's economy and society has changed, NUS itself has evolved principally through a broadening of education, a much greater emphasis on experiential learning, and borrowing many of the ideas from the US and other universities. But as we were looking into the future, one of the issues, of course, is not how do we just address the issues of the present, but 10, 15, 20 years down the road, what do we have to do today in order to position our university and our country with its lack of resources relative to much larger and rapidly growing economies and societies in our region. And I think that is the fundamental thing which I thought I should mention because it undergirds a lot of the things that we do. In relation to the Yale-NUS College, as we were thinking about how we can further improve education and position for the future, in 2008, Ministry of Education's International Advisory Panel, of which actually Andy Hamilton is a member, suggested that we look at setting up a liberal arts college in Singapore for the reason that they felt that we were at a stage where we needed to nurture at least a segment of our students to be able to work things out easily from first principles, to be able to tackle complex problems across different disciplines, to have what I call the kind of zoom in, zoom out capability, having the breadth to be able to zoom out and see the connections between issues, and yet be able to zoom in rigorously and examine the problem and come up with innovative solutions. And of course, the premise was that this is the kind of education that an increasing proportion of the very best students in Singapore and in Asia will be interested in. So in 2008, because this resonated with what NUS was thinking about, we did a feasibility study. Several of my colleagues visited liberal arts colleges in the US, Oxford and Cambridge, and we concluded, yes, that this was something important to do, and therefore we decided really that the liberal arts education should be created as an important new part of NUS, not replacing the things that we're already doing, but to add an important new dimension, which we think will position us well for the future, but also which will, as Peter Salovey mentioned, help us to learn a lot more about the way in which people learn and the learning environments that could then be brought back to the rest of NUS so that we can continually raise the quality of education.
Thank you, Chuan. Just a follow-up question. In 2009, you met Rick at Davos, famously in the lore of Yale-NUS. And what possessed you to ask Yale to be the partner of NUS in developing this college?
Well, I think it's the reason why we have so many cafes in NUS, that these unintended meetings, the meeting's unintended agenda can lead to some very important insights, and in this case, very important consequences. Well, when I was actually catching up with Rick in Davos, I was discussing about this, what I've just said, the things that we're interested in, and within nanoseconds, I realized that Rick had very, very similar ideas, and of course had been working on it for a much longer time and with much deeper insights. And I would say that within a few minutes, I was convinced that both of us were thinking along essentially the same lines. And NUS has had a history of partnerships which have been extremely helpful for us to improve the standards of our education, but also to change the culture of a university. We have partnerships with MIT, with Duke, with Johns Hopkins. And so we saw this really partnership model, as Peter Salovey says, to be a very important way of doing something new without starting from scratch and learning all the difficulties of setting a liberal arts college from start. So I think it was, I think this convergence of vision, but also I would say, Rick, if I may, the chemistry which I felt, and that this was I think a university that I felt we could really work on to bring this forward.
Wonderful, thank you. So Rick, what inclined you and others at Yale to take up Chuan's proposal at that point? This is again along the marriage analogy.
Yeah. 3 reasons. The right idea, the right partner, and the right time. So this was the right idea for actually a couple of reasons. First, as we had developed Yale's internationalization agenda, which started with opening ourselves up to international students early in the new millennium in a much more aggressive way, and then followed by initiating many programs with around the world of a variety of types. Among them was working with Asian universities and Asian governments to talk about the sort of American model of higher education and exchange ideas. So from about 2005, Yale had been hosting a program with presidents and vice presidents from Chinese universities to sort of share ideas about the advancement of education. And it had become clear to me over that period that liberal education was a missing element, and something that China was beginning to realize it needed in the development of its own system. and actually in trips to India and Singapore and other places, it became clear to me that while at a time when America was looking at Asia and worrying about, oh my gosh, they're training so many engineers, they're going to eat our lunch, Asians were looking at America and saying, my goodness, they have an educational system that produces innovators and leaders and creative thinkers with imagination, and we need that in Asia. And so the idea was ripe, I thought, for the development of liberal arts college in Asia. Second reason the idea was ripe was really it arose from a kind of personal frustration, which was some of us at Yale had lots of ideas about improving undergraduate education and about some of the, in a way, unfortunate directions that liberal education has gone in America. An undergraduate curriculum that's too fragmented, not unified, where the notion of a common experience had been lost, where the notion of kind of a meaningful mastery of different disciplines had been lost to a kind of, menu of distribution requirements that really didn't accomplish the purposes of the original Yale College that you talked about. So changing the curriculum of as venerable an institution as Yale is not easy. And we tried I think you were involved Charles was involved in the curriculum report of Yale College that was early in the first decade of the century, which quite frankly disappointed me because it was very modest incremental change, all positive, but very modest and very incremental. And here was an opportunity to start from scratch and design 21st century liberal education. It was phenomenal. I mean, what a chance. So that was the right idea. Right partner, as Chorh said, I had an opportunity to work with, in my opinion, the best possible colleague for this kind of experiment, a person with vision and imagination and real ambition to do something meaningful and important. And from the beginning, we just hit it off, and we've worked, and it's still true. We still work together beautifully. And it was more than that, because not only was it Chuan alone, but Chuan and I each had secret weapons, because we each had a senior operating executive that we knew we could trust to pull this off. So Lily Kong and Linda Lorimer basically took this task on. And you cannot imagine how much work this was. I mean, and all we had to do was sit around and think about it every once in a while. And, there's 12 or 13 hours difference depending on the time of year. And, there were not many days at 7 a.m. in one place and 7 p.m. in the other that these two weren't on the phone themselves sometimes with committees on other times, just, getting things done. And so we basically were lucky to have the right people and to sort of pull this off. Right partner. Right time. It was January 2009. Okay. Over the 3.5 months prior to that, Yale had lost $6.5 billion in the stock market, in the markets. Our endowment had fallen by 25%. We were facing $350 million of budget cuts to implement over the next couple of years. And so I had no resources available for innovation. We were at home, there was not a lot we could do. Andy was smart enough to leave the provost job literally 2 weeks before the market crashed and Peter came in holding the bag. But we, so we found ourselves in this position. Here all of a sudden was Chuan coming with the full faith and credit of the Singaporean government behind him, saying, "You guys just innovate, we'll pay the bill." It was here we get to do something really fantastic, ambitious, and innovative, at the expense of the Singaporean government, which has been an amazing partner. So that was great.
Rick, maybe you could also say a little bit about the planning process at Yale in the years after that.
Sure. Well, it was a planning process at both institutions, really. So what we did, very early on, we came, I guess, early in the summer of '09. We brought a founding team with Linda and I and Peter and Charles Balin and other colleagues, Deborah Davis and Tony Kronman, came over from Yale to sort of take a look and figure out, is this going to work? And we were so enthusiastic. Everybody was super excited about proceeding. And so we set up a committee structure of faculty. One to look at the curriculum, one to look at faculty development, how would we recruit and sustain a strong faculty. The third to look at undergraduate life, at residential life, and co-curricular and extracurricular aspects of the new college. And these committees were at Yale and also at NUS, and they communicated also at these weird hours of the day to plan. And really, that was very stimulating work. And it sort of became the reason this worked is the more that people touched this, the more they got excited about it. And so there was a certain amount of contagion within the faculty involved with it that really got a lot of momentum behind it. I think that was true at NUS as well. So, you know, that group had preliminary conclusions. By the summer of 2010, we reached an agreement, a memorandum of understanding that we would go forward at that point, and then, you know, kept working on the details.
And George, when there was some skepticism in general about whether liberal arts education would appeal to practically minded Kiasu Singaporeans, and what do you think accounts for the fact that, I mean, evidently it does have appeal, but what do you think accounts for that appeal?
We, in 2008, we did a feasibility study, and we did actually a lot of surveys of students, parents, employers, as well as quite a number of focus groups. And from what we could tell, although the general understanding of liberal arts education in Singapore is relatively low, and it was even lower in the rest of the region. In fact, when we say liberal arts, quite a lot of people think it's dancing, theatre, and we have to explain. In fact, there's mathematics and science in it. But amongst some of the more talented students, in fact, knowledge of it was pretty good. And if you look at the general pattern of applications, more and more of the more talented students, unfortunately for us, are moving away from engineering and science. But fortunately for us in another way, more of them are expressing their interest in liberal arts type of education. And I think this reflects understanding that breadth with rigor and ability to work things out from first principles is going to be very important for the future. Students could not access it in Singapore because there's no option before. And therefore, the premise that we had was that if we were able to do it in Singapore, we'll attract and retain some of the very best Singaporean students and also attract some from overseas, provided we could assure everybody that the quality was going to be outstanding. And I think in that regard, I think partnering with Yale provided that quality, because everybody knew that if Yale put its name to something, that it would ensure that it met all the quality standards that are associated with Yale. So having said that, of course we were very anxious about all this, because this is all theoretical, right? The surveys, studies. We can tell from recent elections, for example, how informal surveys can be so badly wrong. And so we were very relieved when the first admission we had so many applicants of very high quality, and the inaugural class, I think, was great delight and also great relief to see such tremendous students. And I would say that once that was established, then it became a question of, well, was this just a first year effect? Was this a pioneer effect? Can we continue this? And fortunately we did. Of course, Rick and I did some additional things just to hedge our bets. I remember there was 2 weeks where Rick, Linda, and myself were calling around people for internships, and this was quite extraordinary because we had no product. We had just an idea, and we said, in 2 years' time, we're going to set up this college, and would you give internships to our students? And immediately, I think 40 companies ranging from Pepsi Cola to SIA, Singapore Airlines agreed. So that we proudly put down the list on our promotional material, and we also assured everybody that we'll pay careful attention to internships, job placements, and so on. So we did those things, particularly in the zillions of talks which Jeremiah and the teams went out to explain this. Charles played an instrumental role too. Many, I think, must have been at least a couple of hundred outreach sessions to within Singapore, within the region, to explain what is this liberal arts education all about, what is Yale-NUS about, why should you think about it as a choice. And I think all those efforts combined, I think led to the results. So it was a tremendous amount of very hard work on the ground by our colleagues that enabled us, I think, to come to a happy outcome.
So I'll open the floor in just a moment. If people have questions, there are 3 microphones. I'll keep a couple of questions in reserve. But Rick, let me ask you, there was some skepticism among faculty at Yale about the environment for academic freedom in Singapore. So what steps did you take to ensure that the environment would be conducive to a liberal education?
Well, this was obviously very important to Yale, and we had worried about it from the beginning and had talked in great depth, not only with Chuan, but with a number of government officials about how we could ensure the kind of academic freedom on this campus that was would be conducive to strong liberal education. It took some time and patience, but I think ultimately we reached an understanding that freedom of ideas, freedom of expression, freedom of inquiry would be fully protected in the work of our students and faculty, and that while there were laws in Singapore that would need to be observed, for example, no public demonstrations in the downtown in front of government buildings, and that there might be certain kinds of rules about publication, certain kinds of inability to publish certain kinds of material in the popular press, for example, that scholarly work and student expression and expression, on the campus and subject matter and access to books and so forth would not be restricted on our campus. And I have to say that's been honored. I mean, there have been a couple of incidents since the college opened where a particular book or film was banned in Singapore for public display, and yet the college was able to get access to those materials for its own internal use. I think it's worked out fine.
And Chuan, any thoughts about how faculty recruitment proceeded? And I mean, I won't ask you to go into detail about that, but just the general process of bringing together a faculty for this venture.
Well, I think the critical success factor for the college was, in fact, that we were able to choose a new set of faculty. Because as Rick says, if you had a traditional arrangement where you use existing faculty, it's not very easy to make big changes, and therefore we were selecting individuals who demonstrated a real passion and interest in teaching outside of a narrow area, in a collaborative teaching efforts, and in a new form of educational engagement. And I mean, credit actually goes to Rick and I think colleagues in Yale for devising a very interesting, innovative recruitment process where from the hundreds of people who applied, the shortlisted ones actually came down and talked in groups amongst themselves, criticized our curriculum, and we were completely open and happy that they did. Recommended ways by which it could be improved, and then said how they would actually contribute to the teaching. And I think this process allowed us to identify those who were genuinely invested in this project, those who were not just saying, but were prepared to identify areas where they could contribute. And I would say that that is possibly one of the most important factors for the success of the curriculum, because in the end it's not what is on paper, it's what is actually experienced in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And I know full credit, I think, goes to Rick and the team for developing this recruitment method.
I do think, thank you for that, but I think actually your folks played a big role as well. But that was one of the exciting things about doing something from scratch. We really were able to do a lot of things that were quite different. So first of all, no departments. This was something we agreed to probably in that first conversation. No departments, so that there'd be a common interest in undergraduate education without the parochialism that departments introduce. And then this recruitment method, which was phenomenal. Because, first of all, it's just a question of criteria. You're recruiting people because they want to contribute to the mission of the college, not just on the standard grounds that they're an excellent scholar, an excellent teacher. So a real buy-in as part of the recruitment process. But then doing it in groups in the early stage was great because we brought people together. They all kind of knew they were job candidates. They also knew there were enough jobs they weren't really competing with each other, that they could all be chosen if they. And so we were able to look at not only what they said about their commitment to the college, we actually saw how they interacted with colleagues, what kind of colleague they would be in the planning of a new venture. And I think that kind of screening process really helped us.
I will say on that, I think we had about 15 of these faculty workshops. Maybe we've had more than that by now. There's a good cohort effect and there's a bad cohort effect. I remember one workshop that resulted in hiring about 10 people, all great, right? And then another where we had 10 people that we liked just as much. And I think they all got together and talked about it and decided to stay at their home institutions.